Well, welcome to today's webinar, our Goodman Speakers webinar. It's been a while. We've kind of taken the summer off, which was nice. And I am so thrilled to be back with the beautiful Raven Solomon. We got to know each other this spring, and I just think that you're fantastic and knew that I needed to do one of these webinars with you to get you out in front of our lovely clients because your content is so good and so timely. So Raven is a global diversity, equity, and inclusion thought leader and nationally recognized keynote speaker who helps organizations get future ready by understanding generations, racial equity, and their intersection. So today we are chatting with Raven Solomon about closing the generational gap, and I will let you take that away. Thanks, Raven.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Jenna. I am super excited to be with you all today. Happy Monday, I think. I don't know, all the days are just running together for me at this point, but if you're watching this recording, happy whatever day it is for you. As Jenna mentioned, today we're going to talk about this concept, this idea of closing the generational gap, because I think all of us can admit that at least within the last month or so, we've had some sort of contention arise, perhaps, or some sort of differences amongst generations pop up and cause some degree of frustration or contention for us, right? Or something popped up and created some degree of ambiguity or confusion first for us, right? And for our organizations. And in some capacity, perhaps it impacted results or it impacted our ability to show up and to do our best work. And so my job is to really help us understand these generational gaps and differences that exist amongst us, and then help us essentially close that gap, right? So that we are able, organizationally and individually, to work together, to collaborate across those differences, and really to leverage those differences in pursuit of whatever organizational goals that we may have. Right? And so I think if we're going to close this generational gap, then we first have to start with understanding what generations are, why they are as they are, and how they cause some degree of difference amongst us. Then I think we've got to have a clear understanding of what these generational differences actually are. And then we've got to figure out how we leverage those differences. So today we only have a couple of minutes together. So I'm going to talk about what generations are, how they come to be. So I'm going to talk about part one, and then I'm going to talk just a tiny bit about these generational differences that exist amongst us. So hopefully you walk away knowing at least one thing that you didn't know before we hopped in. All right, so let's go ahead and jump right on in. Whenever I have a conversation about generational diversity and inclusion, I have to start with what I call a generational roll call, right? Because we don't have a lot of time together today. I'm not going to go through the full roll call, but I do want to acknowledge individually every generation, every living generation that exists today in the United States. I'm going to go through these individually really quickly. And I'm going to ask that if you're on here live, that you just drop in the chat which generation you're representing. Show some generational pride, if you will, for a moment. So let's start with the greatest generation. The greatest generation is currently over the age of 97. We probably don't have any folks from the greatest generation on our call today, nor do we have any in our workforce. However, we pay homage to them nonetheless. The next generation is known as the silent generation, more commonly known as traditionalists. So traditionalists are currently between the ages of 76 and 96. Next up, baby boomers, one of my favorite generations, currently between the ages of 57 and 75, right? 57 and 75. If you're a boomer, go ahead and drop it in the chat, represent for your generation. I'm not here to date you by any means. Gen X, currently between the ages of 42 and 56 years old. I love Gen Xers. Gen Xers also love Gen Xers. I'm just saying, I call Gen X the original me generation, okay? They think millennials are the me generation. I personally think it's Gen X because they always are the loudest group and the proudest group. So shout out to Gen X. Next up, we've got this generation sometimes known as Gen Y, more commonly known as millennials. If you're a millennial out there, definitely give it up for yourselves. Currently between the ages of 26 and 41. That is correct. Millennials are grown adults. They are not the ones last year down in Miami spreading the coronavirus. That wasn't them. They have kids, they have families, they have careers. They're 40. The last generation I want to highlight today is Generation Z, sometimes referred to as Centennials, but certainly more commonly known as Gen Z. Gen Z is currently between the ages of 9 and 25. There are folks on this earth younger than 9, so there is another generation behind Gen Z. Right now, they're referred to as Gen Alpha. That name may change, so for the sake of our time together today, we'll just call them kids, right? Let's just let them be kids. Let's talk about the definition of generations, right? What is a generation? How does it come to be? Why do generations exist? And why do we see differences amongst us that can perhaps cause some contention, frustration, etc.? What is a generation? In short, a generation is the aggregate of all people born within roughly a 20-year time span, right? Around one phase of life. This definition doesn't really help us. We thank Webster for it, phenomenal. However, it doesn't really help us understand what generations are, why they are, and how they come to be. And so I always like to share just 3 quick criteria to help us all really understand what generations are and why they exist. So criteria number 1, those who share a generation tend to have these 3 things in common. One is they share an age, location, in history. What does that mean, Raven? All that means is that they encounter certain events during the same phase of life, right? Certain key historic events, big, monumental, generationally defining moments. These things happen and they ultimately shift norms in some way, and they create a new normal, whether that's socially, politically, technologically, so forth and so on, right? So these things, they happen and they change the way that we think and the way that we behave as a society, thus creating some distinction from one generation to another in behavior. So for example, for past generations, one of these big, monumental, key historic events might have been the Great Depression. For many of us on the call today, it could be the Great Recession of 2008, right? For some of us, it's the introduction of email. Many of us on the call remember a time in the workplace when email did not exist. So the infiltration, the emergence of this major, major shift in the way that we communicate absolutely changes norm, and it changes the way that we think and the way that we behave. So do me a favor, drop in the chat, maybe one generationally defining moment for your generation. What's that generationally defining key historic event, whether it's social, political, technological, etc., that happened perhaps in your coming of age years that really shifted culture? It changed the way that we think and the way that we behave. I'll tell you some of the ones I often hear. I often hear the emergence of cell phones, smartphones. I mean, the fact that we hold many computers in our hands on a day-to-day basis is mind-boggling for some folks. So when we think about marketing and the utilization of social media, for some of us, this is brand new. For others, it's always been. Right? And so there's a clear distinction in how we think, how we behave, and what we define to be normal. I'll give you another example, just for me personally. I remember exactly where I was when one of my key historic events happened, one of these generationally defining moments for my generation. I was sitting in my US history classroom. It was September 11th. And I remember my teacher rolling this thing out. Y'all remember these things? Listen, whenever you saw this, you knew 2 things. One of 2 things was about to happen. Either you had a substitute teacher and you were about to watch a meaningless, non-value adding video for the day, which was always awesome, or something really, really important in society or in the locale was happening that you needed to know about. And on this particular day, it was the latter. So I remember very vividly my teacher rolling this thing out, and my generation, millennials, watching the most horrific thing we had ever seen in our lifetime occur right before our very eyes. And so millennials are forever bonded by 9/11 because we occupied the same phase of life, which was young adulthood, when this generationally defining moment happened. This moment where normal changed. So that's the first piece of criteria. The second piece of criteria that those who share a generation tend to have in common is they tend to have common beliefs and behaviors. And a lot of that goes back to the fact that these generationally defining moments happen, these societal trends, these culture shaping factors occur in our coming of age years. And they absolutely play a role in how we behave and what we believe to be normal as a generation. For example, if I ask one generational group about gender roles in the home, I may get a completely different answer than if I ask perhaps Gen Z or if I ask millennials, right? And so we have these common beliefs and behaviors based upon when we grew up, how we grew up, and what was happening in society during that time. So that's why we think differently, we behave differently, we show up differently. The last piece of criteria that those who share a generation have in common is they have this sense of common perceived membership. What does that mean? All that means is that every one of us believes that our generational experience is just unique, it's different. It could be better, it could be worse, but nonetheless, it's distinct. It's special, it's peculiar. We all have this generational pride. How many of you have ever said, you kids don't know what real music is. This is not real music. Let me show you what real music is. How is it that every generation thinks that they had real music? We all have this common sense of perceived membership, right? We see these memes all over the internet of things like this. Today's generation will never understand what it's like. And they're very true. There is an entire generation walking the face of this earth that doesn't know and understand the gratification that comes with physically hanging the phone up on someone. Pushing a button is just not the same in the heat of the moment, right? I've got something specifically for my millennials. My Gen Xers may remember this time too, but millennials, do you remember this? Yeah, the struggle was indeed real, trying to carry around this big CD player. And then you had to carry the CDs themselves as well. And it all had to fit somewhere. And then God forbid it fell out of your pocket and it slid across the concrete and your favorite CD slid too. And it scratched up song number 9. Which was your favorite? I've got a personal connection with this, as you can see. I've got something for my Gen Xers and my baby boomers too. Gen Xers, baby boomers, do you remember these? Yeah, I'm sure my millennials and my Gen Zers are lost, and I don't have time to explain it to you. So maybe I can get a Gen Xer or a baby boomer to drop it in the chat, or better yet, how about you have a conversation about this in your next team meeting or perhaps over coffee or what have you. But imagine having to use this thing. Now we use voicemail. But as you're seeing this, if you're Gen X or you're baby boomer, you're probably having this sense of nostalgia. You're probably seeing these things and you're remembering a time, you're smiling. You've got this common sense of perceived membership. And all of these things that we've talked about are all fun and games, of course. And where that common sense of perceived membership can become problematic is when we begin to think that our generational experience is not just different or special, but it is somehow superior, right? That our way is the way. That's when it can become problematic. And that's where we see generational bias pop in and become a challenge in organizations every single day. And so how do we show up with this generational pride, but not stifle and shut down the contributions of those within our teams that simply think differently? Not better, but different. Let's talk just quickly about some of the generational differences that exist amongst us. I really just got to highlight maybe one thing about each generation. And then we'll have time for a question or two before I let you get out of here. But as we talk about these generational differences, I think it's important to note one thing, two things to be precise. The first is that the word generation, as you can see, and the word generalization have a little something in common, right? They share the same root word, which simply just means a group or a class of individuals. Why do I say this? When we talk about generations, we are absolutely making a lot of generalizations. The reason being is because we're talking about big groups of folks. We're talking about sociology, social trends, right? And so, of course, everything I say about your generation, you might not identify with. And the same thing goes for the person sitting beside you. But for the most part, what we're talking about is sociology, big mega trends that can provide context for us understanding the individual. The other thing I want to point out and preface with is the fact that intersectionality absolutely matters. It matters. If you're not familiar with this term, let me just share with you really quickly what it is and why it's important to consider, especially when you're engaging with people and leading people. Intersectionality is really about the convergence of identities, right? That we each have that really create this unique reality for subsets of people within a given group. Let me use my friend Brad and I as an example. So Brad and I both are millennials. There are a lot of things we have in common because of our shared millennialhood. However, there are other identities that we have individually that we do not share. And those identities absolutely create a distinct experience even within our shared millennialhood for myself and Brad. So myself being a woman, Brad identifying as a man, we show up differently. We experience the world differently. Myself being Black, Brad being white, again, we experience the world differently. Let's talk really, really quickly about each generation. I'm just going to point out again one highlight that I think is always important for us to remember about each. We'll share just a couple of minutes for Q&A and then I'll get you out of here, okay? So when it comes to baby boomers, one of the things I absolutely love about baby boomers is the fact that they tend to be rule followers, right? So baby boomers grew up in a time where children were seen and not heard. They were not vocally empowered as children like we are today. What was present at the table is what you ate. You didn't have a vote. You weren't asked how you feel. You didn't have a contribution half of the time to the household like we do today, and certainly like millennials did growing up, where we saw this parenting really shift. And so with that being said, baby boomers really, really value hard work. They value respect. They value visibility. They're extremely loyal. And so one thing that I think is always important to point out for baby boomers is this, what I call a lead language. And I wish I had time to unpack that, but I don't. For baby boomers, really being about respect. So if you give them respect in the workplace, respect of their tenure, respect of their experience, their time, you're prone to get the best results out of them, right? So they want respect for the things that they've done, the contributions that they've made, the path that they've blazed, right? And there's so much more that I want to unpack here, but I just don't have time. So let's go on to Gen X. One of the things I love to talk about when it comes to Gen X is the fact that Gen X is super duper independent. Gen X was the first generation to grow up as latchkey kids. If you're a Gen Xer, you know exactly what a latchkey kid is, whether you were a latchkey kid or not. But many Gen Xers were responsible for fending for themselves for hours at a time at the age of 6 and 8 and 10. And so they're very self-reliant. Why does that matter? Well, when it comes to the workforce, we see that translate into this autonomy, right? This desire for trust and freedom and space. Micromanaging doesn't work for Gen X. They need their space, their elbow room. That's the best way you get results out of Gen X. And so millennials are vastly different. Millennials were parented on the other end of the spectrum. They were over-parented in many ways, growing up with these people in their lives called helicopter parents, right? These people who are overprotective, and they take this excessive interest in the lives of their children. And so with that, there's this kind of dichotomy, right? There's Gen X, super independent, I need my space, leave me alone. Millennials who are, hey, I need attention. I need feedback. I want you to ask me how my work is. I want you to care about my career desire and my career progression. I want in-person performance reviews. I need consistent feedback, right? That's what we mean when we talk about personal attention being of value for millennials. Let's talk about Gen Z just really, really quickly. One of the things I want to point out when it comes to Gen Z is the fact that they are super duper passionate. Some may call it sensitive. I call it passion. When it comes to the things that they care about, when it comes to morality and ethics, equity is something that Gen Z particularly values and is looking for in organizations. So it's not just diversity, it's not just the mention of inclusion, but they are looking for equitable practices, policies, procedures that actually drive inclusion. In fact, it's the number one factor equity is that indicates for Gen Z whether they should trust an organization or not. And so the value on diversity, equity, and inclusion that this generation is putting on institutions, organizations, associations, etc., is something that we've never seen before. So this is one of the reasons why this content matter is so important. And by this content matter, I mean diversity, equity, and inclusion content matter, because this generation is about to be a quarter of the US workforce in just 5 years. They are massive. They have $150 billion of buying power. And they are also the largest living generation in the US, by the way. So they've got girth. And I just believe that this generation might just bring about the change that many of us have been looking forward to. So that being said, I wish I had more time to engage with you. I usually invite all of my audiences to take what I call the generational view challenge. It's very simple. It's a commitment to engage at least one person of one other generation before you make your next 3 big decisions, whether those decisions are personal or professional. I need you to engage just one person of one other generation before you make your next 3 big decisions. I think that's how, just one way, simple way, that we truly leverage the generational differences that exist amongst us. And the business case for that is superb. I wish I had time to unpack that. Thank you so much for your time, your attention. You've got my contact information here on the screen. Of course, Jenna has my contact information as well and would be a great conduit for us connecting. So Jenna, I'm going to hand it back to you.
Oh, thank you, Raven. That was fantastic. And I laughed quite a bit when you showed the television. That it was so timely for back to school right now, as my kids are heading back to school yesterday, today, second day, and they would have no idea what that thing was. Okay, so Raven, you are the author of the book Leading Your Parents. I wanted to, make that known here, as well as let's talk a little bit more about some of your other content. Your generational gap is so incredible and so timely. But inclusive leadership is something that you speak in great depths about. So I wanted to kind of touch on that a little bit. If you could share maybe a little bit about that and some other content matter that you've been sharing with audiences.
Yeah, absolutely. I will say that closing the generational gap is our number one keynote overall, right, over the last 5 years. But how to be an inclusive leader is quickly gaining. And I would say over the last 12 months has certainly been our most requested message. And the tenets of that, it really is about how we create environments of inclusion. we talk about inclusion all of the time, and it can really be an ambiguous word for a lot of folks. And so this message just lays out 6 of the things that each and every one of us can do, should do, especially if we're leaders, to truly create this circle of inclusion around us, is what I call it. And so just for example, one of those traits that I talk about extensively in that conversation is this trait of curiosity, right? Imagine if each and every one of us approached our daily work being more curious, right? Imagine if we approached leading our teams with a certain degree of curiosity on a day-to-day basis. We ask better questions. We listen differently, right? We're inquisitive. We are transparent. So there are a lot of fruits that come from curiosity alone. And there are other traits that we go in depth about, but I love talking about that one in particular because it's something that each and every one of us can pinpoint right now, an area where we can lean into that. And so how to be an inclusive leader is all about literally how to create inclusion, not just diversity, right? The presence of difference.
That's fantastic. And you and I have had some really good conversation about why this is so important right now to be on everybody's agenda, and why are we putting this on the docket for meetings? And maybe you can speak a little to that too.
Yeah, absolutely. I think all of the messages that I deliver have a place, right, on the docket for conferences. I think the generational conversation is one that is so timely for a number of reasons. One is everyone sees themselves in that conversation, right? If we're going to talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion, and we're kind of new to that conversation, starting with generational diversity is a really good place because it's less, for lack of better words, uncomfortable for folks. It's a little less distinctive. Some may say divisive, etc., just kind of depending on where they are in this process. And so everyone sees themselves. So every audience member can relate and feel seen. And I get that feedback all the time. The other thing is, I mentioned Gen Z is coming, and they're coming in mass. And so there's a huge distinction between millennials and Gen Z. And if we're not ready for that, then we are going to struggle, right? And then the other reason I would say this generational conversation is important is because generational differences, to me, are becoming more and more distinct because of the speed at which everything is changing. If you remember, I mentioned Gen Z is currently between the ages of 9 and 25. Can you imagine the difference in experience a 9-year-old is having versus a 24-year-old? I mean, they really should be two different generations. And so if we were approaching it more logically, we probably would consider 8 generations in the US, in the workforce, right? Just depending on how we're looking at it. So I'd say those 3 reasons are prime reasons why this conversation needs to be on the docket.
Yeah, I love it. I mean, I never had really, I've seen so many generation talks, and I've never really made that connection about the generational gap being, kind of the original corporate inclusion conversation, and because you, like you said, you relate to something, but you don't, you have to learn how to work with people, talk to people of other generations, and it's all, kind of basic inclusion. And it's incredible. I think it's a really nice segue, a beautiful segue really to where we've come, where we are when we talk about diversity and inclusion and the importance of it. And I love to hear that you say, the Gen Z is coming in full charge, kind of holding us accountable. And I think that's great. I do believe that they are going to be the change that we need. I think I love that you said that. And I think that people need to hear that too.
Yeah, absolutely.
Message of hope, and it's all good. Sometimes we're scared of what the future holds, but in this case, I think they might do it better than we do. So
I think so. And then, there's a talk that I give about understanding and motivating Gen Z. And can you imagine, we've got this hope for this generation, yet they kind of feel that pressure. And so we see higher degrees of anxiety, depression, and that's just one of the reasons why. There are many reasons why. But it's a very complex generation for that reason as well. But I love what you said. They are our hope at this point.
They are hope. Yes, their world is very fast paced. That's for sure.
Mhm.
Well, thank you so much, Raven. This was incredible. You're brilliant, and you're such a pleasure to work with, and such a wonderful partner. So thank you for doing this. Thank you so much for joining us today, and thanks to all who were able to be here with us live or watching the recording on your own time. Thank you very much, and everyone have a beautiful day.
Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Raven.